Okay, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. In case you didn't notice, there are snacks and beverages available on the table over here, so please help yourself. Tonight's talk is going to be by Dr. Michael Clark, who is the Wallace and Marion Remlin Chair in Free Market Economics at Hillsdale College. He received his PhD in economics from George Mason University. He's taught a wide variety of classes, including international trade, constitutional political economy, Austrian economics, the history of economic thought, and development economics. His research interests include studying the works of Friedrich Hayek as well as Adam Smith, and he has a focus on the interaction between political economy and long-run economic development. Okay. I'd like to thank the Institute for Humane Studies for generously supporting this event. And with that, I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Clark.
Oh, yes, 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 I have a voice. All right, not only a soul, but also a voice. That works out great for me. So we have this question, do economists have a soul? Economics, morality, and social policy. So that's a great title, it's a great idea, but I have a little different setup for us. I have a little question for us to ask, and it's kind of a serious one. I'm asking this question of you. Why are you here? Right? And I don't mean this like metaphysical sense, like the meaning of life. I just mean, why are you here? Like, why did you show up on a Friday night to come and listen to some guy talk about why do economists have a soul, right? And maybe some of you guys are like, well, it was assigned as a homework assignment, so I had to be here, right? But let's assume something better than that. Let's assume something stronger than that. Why did you take the time out of your weekend to come be here? I have a little simple answer that you're not going to like, but my simple answer essentially is to study economics. And most of you say, oh, okay, this guy's sharp. Right? It may seem like a simple answer, but I'm going to try and argue that this answer has more meaning than you might think it has or that you might realize that it has. I think economics, when done correctly, helps us prudently engage with bigger things, much more so than its cold reputation suggests. I think it helps us think about moral issues and social policy and the big questions that we're all concerned with. Well, my goal for tonight's lecture is to get us thinking about why we would even have to ask the topic's question of, do economists have a soul? And how the nature of economics essentially requires that this question is a reality for good economists. Right? So I'm gonna make this argument that we basically are always going to have this question, do economists have a soul, because of the nature of good economics, right? So I'm going to tell some stories. It'll be kind of laid back. I'll tell some interesting stuff. If you don't like one of my stories, good. It's over in like 5 minutes and I'll do a different one, all right? So it'll be pretty fast moving, a few different stories that we'll get through. But I want you to always have in the back of your head that basic statement that I just made. I want us to think about how the nature of good economics essentially requires the soul question. Do economists have a soul? Right? I want us to think about that question in the back of our head. So why is it that economics requires essentially the question, do economists have a soul? Right? Now, for a second here, let's break down the idea that I said good economics, right, or good economists are going to always have us asking this question, do economists have a soul? What do I mean by good economists? To be really short about this, I basically mean economists who talk about or who focus on emergent phenomenon, or economics as a process. And that's really going to be the first topic, or my first story that I have for you guys, is going to focus on economics as a process and what I kind of mean by that, the gist of what I mean by that. All right? So the first story that I have is called The Evolution of Music. This is a story I do a lot of times in my classes. I actually have a article on the Freeman that does the evolution of music story, but this is my little tale here. So if we think about how music is transmitted to us as entertainment, okay? So nothing econo speak, no equations, no supply and demand graphs where they cross or anything, right? Nothing scary about this. How we transmit entertainment through music. Originally, we can kind of go back to, let's go to the early 20th century and let's say like big band, right? We'd go to the dance halls and we'd have to go to the dance halls and we'd have these big band and we'd, go out and we'd consume the music, right? And then at around the late 40s, we got these things called vinyls. Do you guys know a vinyl, a record, right? So we had records, and then around the late 60s, we got the 8-track, right? So for the 70s, the 8-track was the cool thing. Most of you guys probably have heard that, but don't really know 8-tracks. But then the next thing, most of you guys still know, and that's the cassette, right? So the cassette was next. We had the cassette, you could like take the pencil and wind it, if it got the loop or whatever, right? And you could record the radio off of things, and you would make the mixtape by recording different songs off the radio, and it was all this stuff, and it seemed great. But the next thing was awesome. It was a CD, right? So the next thing was a CD, and that really became popular late 80s, right? And so we have this thing called the CD, and this is when you guys were kids, right? You had mostly CDs, but you probably know what tapes are, right? That's you guys are. I'm not getting that much older than you guys, right? So that's what we had. Now, what you guys probably won't remember because you were too young is that in the 90s, we all knew CDs were what we had, and we had all seen the big band to records, to 8-track, to tape cassettes, to CDs. We all saw that. And we all knew that those massive, 150 disc towers that we owned were going to be obsolete pretty soon, right? And those big, CD case things with, the 4 slots in it, and you had, 200 CDs in it. We all knew that was, on its way out eventually. And we all thought we knew exactly what was going to replace it. We thought that it was going to be replaced by the mini CD. Everybody really kind of had this in the back of their head. What's going to replace CDs? It's going to be like this little CD. Okay. On Men in Black, you watched the original Men in Black movie, right? I know you guys don't know that there was a 1 and a 2. Now that 3's out, but there was a 1 and a 2, actually. On the original, they even make a reference towards this. So, Tommy Lee is like, yeah, this is going to be the next CD. I'm going to have to get the White Album again. Right? Because everybody knows that the mini CD's next. It just made sense, right? What the heck is this guy talking about? That's what you guys are asking right now, right? What came next? What came next is unbelievable. What came next is actually nothing. That's messed up. It's this little thing in the ether called an MP3. It doesn't really actually exist. It's nothing you can hold on to. It's nothing. Nothing replaced the CD. Right? We had these things that were just MP3s. They were digital files in the cloud or, whatever, right? That's really weird to think about, that we had this natural progression. Everybody thought we knew what was next, right? But what we got was actually nothing. We had iPods that carried around the digital files that existed, right? So we have this kind of evolution of music story, right, that I want you guys to think about. And what I want you to understand from this is this basic idea that a good economist should be very humble and admit that we don't know the future. An economist's job is not to answer the question, what's next? In fact, an economist's job is to answer, we don't know what's next. And we shouldn't know what's next. The benefits of the process of spontaneous order, of market economies, of evolution of ideas and entrepreneurship actually created the solution that was far better than the mini-CD. Mini-CDs actually did come into existence. Nobody really used them. There was nothing that was really going through, right? But we didn't know that future. The process of how that happened is unbelievable. We didn't know that would be next. I mean, imagine going back to your 1993 self, or maybe you weren't old enough, right, or not born, right? But go back to somebody in 1993 and say, hey, you know CDs, how they followed up from tape cassettes? You know what's going to follow them? Nothing. Convince somebody of that. Right? That's a really weird thing to think about. Convince somebody of that. Nothing will actually replace it. And it will replace it very well. Right? It'll replace it very, very well. And in thinking about this process and not understanding the future, I have another little analogy just to kind of tie it into this. And it's a story of Tomorrowland. Right? So how many of you guys have been to Disney World? Disneyland, either of them? Okay, so I'm talking to some others who know the place, right? It exists. I love Disney World. So you already know I'm kind of a dork because I love Disney World and I'm 32 years old. I don't know how old I am. Something like that, right? I absolutely love it, right? And I was fascinated with Tomorrowland in the way that it looks, right? But this is the original Tomorrowland at Disneyland, okay? And what happened at the original Disneyland when they built Tomorrowland, they built it and they had all of these like different setups of, you know, like here's going to be the house of the future, and they had like these sinks that like raised and lowered for different height people, and like all these like weird things in it, right? And about 5 years after Disneyland opened, there started to be this running joke about Yesterland, because Tomorrowland looked so like ancient only 5 years later. Right? Our vision of the future had changed so rapidly. So what Disneyland had to do when they went through and redid Disneyland about 15 years later, and when they built Disney World, is they actually had to make a retro version of the future so that they wouldn't have to rebuild it every 2 or 3 years. Right? So they actually made like Jules Verne's idea of the future, and then we kept it like that. Because our ideas of the future and what's ahead, we can't predict. It's not like we have this linear thing in front of us and we absolutely know where we're heading. We think that we kind of get where we're going, and yet we never end up being the Jetsons or whatever we think is going to be next, right? We don't know that future. The process unfolds in this emergent way that we could never really comprehend or predict into the future. Imagine telling somebody in 1992 the next thing after a CD is nothing, right? It's impossible. In hindsight, it makes sense, but looking forward, it seems so ridiculous. I remember this you guys would really remember, the iPad coming out. I thought the iPad was the dumbest thing possible. Okay, think about this. We had an iPod, right, which basically held music. Then what we did is we made it a little bit bigger, but we gave it phone capabilities, right? And it was like, hey, this works. Now what we're going to do with that setup is we're going to make it bigger to the point where you can't carry it around in your pocket. It's really kind of annoying in terms of its size. And we're going to take away the phone capability. That's stupid. And it was incredibly ingenious. It's not a bigger phone. It's a smaller computer. Saturday Night Live made fun of the iPad. I remember driving in Fairfax, Virginia, and hearing it announced on the radio and laughing about it. I laughed at the iPad, right? We don't see these things. We think everything just made sense when we look back to the past. But when we forecast to the future, it's actually not as clear as what we think it would, what we would predict that it would be. So we don't know the process until it happened, and that's a really important insight from economics. In fact, we learn from economics that when we think we understand the process, we start to realize that we can't, right? And from this we get the economics concept that probably some of you guys have heard of called unintended consequences, right? So I have a story of unintended consequences that I get from one of my professors at George Mason, mentors, Russ Roberts. If you guys don't know Russ Roberts, haven't heard Econ Talk or read any of his books, you got to look him up. Russ is phenomenal, easy to understand. Econ Talk is serious discussion about different ideas, and he's great on there. So I ripped this story off from him, but I give him full credit. He's awesome. He's an awesome author, a great contributor to the world of economics. But in his book, The Invisible Heart, he tells this story. He tells the story of Yellowstone National Park, and it's all about unintended consequences, right? And so in his story, he says, okay, Yellowstone National Park, it's a beautiful place, right? We've all been to national parks and gone out and just kind of been a part of nature, seen it, breathed it in, and taken its beauty. And he tells this story of what happened at Yellowstone National Park. He says, it's a beautiful place. And in 1900, tons of people came out to Yellowstone. But some of them were scared away by the wolves. So, I mean, it's the wilderness. It's the wild, right? So wolves were around, and it scared some people away. Also, there was farmers nearby that didn't like the wolves roaming around because it ate up their livestock and other issues, right? But people were essentially scared of it. So what they did in managing the park is they said, hey, let's get rid of some of these wolves that are scaring people away. So this is 1900. By 1930, there's no wolves, literally no wolves in Yellowstone National Park, right? We'll pretend that they like shipped them somewhere else, right? Or whatever, right? We'll do a nice version of the story, okay? Okay, so that's kind of our setup here. Well, we have an interesting story from this, right? We really like to see live animals that don't scare us, but we don't like to see wolves. Well, one live animal that we really like to see is an elk. Any of you guys seen an elk in real life? They're huge, right? They're massive animals, but they don't seem all that intimidating or scary. So we like to see them at Yellowstone National Park. So we go, we can see them. So what happens? We get rid of the wolves. So what do you guys think happens to the elk population? What happens then? It's huge, right? We got all kinds of elk, right? So we go through, we get rid of the wolves, we end up with lots of elk. Well, this story actually has 3 animals in it. It's not just wolves, and it's not just elk. It also involves the beaver. What happened is the elk became so numerous in population that what happened is they eat the willow and aspen down by the riverbeds, right? And there were so many of them that they basically ate it all up, and it no longer existed. Well, the beaver needed the willow and aspen to survive. So by getting rid of the wolves, we inflated the elk population, and that killed off all of the beavers. Here's the twist. Wolves eat beavers. So I asked you the easy question, and I said, hey, if we get rid of the wolves, what happens to the number of elk? And you're all like, it's huge, it's really big. Well, why wouldn't we say the same thing about beavers? If I came to you and I said, wolves eat beavers, we get rid of the wolves, what happens to the beaver population? It goes to 0. Wait, that's not obvious at all, right? That's an unintended consequence of the policy of getting rid of the wolves, right? And it's not something that's straightforward, but it happened. So in 1995, they actually reintroduced some wolves to Yellowstone National Park. I don't think there's beaver there anymore. They have to rebuild the entire habitat, all kinds of things, right? But it's an interesting story of unintended consequences. The last one, or the other story of unintended consequences that I have is, I don't know where I heard this from first, but I've heard it somewhere. It's all about ladders, right? So I got this from The hit show Community. I thought you guys would think that was cool because you're out of school. I don't know, whatever, right? They have a class in ladders. Is that what you guys teach here? No, okay, all right. But this is a story of unintended consequences, but this is a pretty simple story, actually. Right? What happened is there ended up being a lot of regulation in the ladder industry in order to make them safer. Right? Like they had to meet all these different standards, all this stuff. So what happened to the price of ladders? It shot way up, right? So now with the price of ladders higher, people own fewer ladders. They have fewer ladders around, even if it's just marginally or whatever. So you end up with people doing things like this, where they're like, going to fix a light bulb and standing on a chair or something, right? Because you don't have a ladder around, or you have fewer ladders. So it's more likely you do something stupid, like standing on a chair, which is way less safe than standing on a not regulated ladder. So we end up with less safety when we're changing a light bulb or something like that, even though the regulation intended to make the situation safer. So sure, you can say when we try and control things, maybe we screw them up. But there's some things that we think will be screwed up if we don't handle them. So there's other elements to the market that you can talk about that don't fit just this natural unintended consequences story. And you kind of have the hard cases of economics essentially to deal with, right? And what I want to talk about is how economics actually, or markets and emergent market stories, process-oriented markets, if we allow markets some freedom, they actually handle some of the things that we think are impossible, right? So I often get these challenges from people who kind of know that I appreciate the market process, and they say, yeah, well, what about this story, right? What about this one specific thing? Say, how's the market going to solve this, right? And what's my response? My response is, I don't know. And that seems pretty unsophisticated. But remember the story of the evolution of music, right? I don't know what the next thing's going to be. But the market, because of profit opportunities and entrepreneurship and the ideas of spontaneous order, actually handles a lot of these things in ways that I could never imagine, right? I didn't know that the next thing after a CD was going to be nothing, right? Ronald Coase always brought this to our attention, and also Thomas Sowell, great economists. They said, listen, there might be failures of the market. The market might not be perfect. So you can hear about free market economics, right? And people say, oh, they just think that everything works out great. I'm a guy who thinks free market economics are great. I don't think they work perfectly or even close to perfectly. I think they fail all the time. But you have to ask the question, compared to what? Do they fail more or less than the alternative? Right? It's not enough to say this doesn't work. You have to say what works better. Right? So if markets fail, we say, aha, markets fail. So therefore, we should have government intervention or something like that. Well, that doesn't make sense. How well does the government intervention work? Right? So we need to seriously take on the challenge. Maybe markets do fail, and maybe the government could work better in some situations. But we can't just point out the failures of the market and then say, aha, we've got you. Right? We have to ask the question, compared to what? And so the way that I like to always talk about this is, I don't think it always works out, but a lot of failures of the market often get solved in ways that we couldn't imagine. So this is kind of my slogan that I say around Hillsdale College a lot of times. Today's market failure is tomorrow's market solution. Right? I think that's an interesting little line to think about, that really a lot of times what happens for big profit opportunities or for big market-oriented opportunities is to see something wrong and fix it. So my mother-in-law, when she first found out that I was like kind of market-oriented, she says, you know what I really hate and where the market always fails is like on food. They like can put on the label like super nutritious, good, yay, right? Or whatever they want on the front of the thing. And then it turns out it's awful for you, right? And so they mislead you, and you can go through, and consumers are incredibly uninformed because there's this thing called asymmetric information, right? And we have this failure of the market. And so she says, how does the market handle that? And I say, I don't know, right? But now I kind of do have a solution. So it's one of my favorite things. It's actually an app. There's an app for it. There's an app for everything, right? But there's an app for this that I use all the time. It's called Fujicate. It's on your phone. It's free. You can go through the grocery aisles and scan it in, and it takes people who know nutrition, and they process like these different products through their system, and they come up with this algorithm, and they basically shoot you out a grade that says like B+, like Doritos, D, right? Apple, A, right? And it's not just because the letters, right? Right? It tells you this is good for you. This is bad. How bad, right? So if you go into my kitchen, to like my pantry, all of like my food items have like these marker B+ things on them. Like my milk jugs have, B+ written on it because I Fujicated it, right? I highly recommend that you guys do this for a little while, because even if you only do it for like 3 weeks, you learn kind of how to spot healthy food and non-healthy food better than you had before, right? So I don't even have to write it in my pantry as much anymore as I used to, but I still do it because we have students over to my house every now and then, and they're like, you didn't have anything written on that milk. And I'm like, yeah, I know, I've bought milk like 4,000 times, whatever, right? But it's a really cool thing. Now, you say, okay, that's great. You just told me about Fujicate, though. How many of you guys had heard about Fujicate before this? One. I got one ringer, right? So obviously this didn't work. My response to that is, we don't want to be informed about our food. We just like to pretend that we want to be informed about our food, right? We'd like that comfort in being like, I want to know if it's healthy. Those jerks selling me these products. But we don't actually want it. We want to pay the low prices and have Doritos, right? Because we like them, right? So if you want the actual information, it's actually pretty free to you if you have a smartphone, which a lot of people do, right? And there's other ways of getting this information that's pretty easy to do. Okay. So if I kind of bring this all together, you could say, I've told you some interesting stories. I've illuminated some vaguely speaking economic concepts here. But how does this all tie in with the purpose of tonight's talk? Like, so what, right? Remember that I asked you to think about how the nature of economics essentially requires the soul question. Do economists have a soul? That this will always be a reality for good economists. What is truly important about the understanding of economics is not having an answer to how to help, how to cure, how to provide. The benefits of economics all come from unseen forces, not from specific answers, right? Think about this. We can't see the future technologies. You don't see the missing beaver at Yellowstone National Park because they don't exist. You don't see the missing ladders. You don't see the failures of the market may only be temporary, and there may be responses to it. All of these things are typically unseen. What economics does is it helps us to see these things. I mean, economics at its core has this message of the unseen. Adam Smith called it the invisible hand, right? F.A. Hayek talked about the idea of the invisible hand. He said these coordinative powers of spontaneous order, he says, can only or cannot be perceived by our senses, but can only be traced by our intellect. It's an invisible hand. Bastiat wrote the seen and the unseen. These are like the heavy hitters of the last 250 years of economics. They all make this central point. The core of what's important, the main line of economics is about illuminating the unseen, helping us see what happens in different arrangements, what we normally would not see. What we know, and your professors here could probably tell you this better than I could. They're both better experts on this than I am. But what we know is that economic freedom works, right? So this one's the Heritage Foundation's one, I think. But it's this index of economic freedom, right? And it's this correlation between per capita GDP and economic freedom. Or sometimes we do it prosperity versus economic freedom. Because some people don't like to think about per capita GDP. Per capita GDP is essentially, are you making a lot of money? So people say, oh, freedom is highly correlated with per capita GDP. In other words, freedom's associated with, yeah, it makes money. Okay, let's say we're not like Uncle Scrooge diving into our money bins, right? That's not all that we care about or something, right? Let's say that we care about something more. So let's say we care about things like access to education, clean drinking water, infant mortality rates, civil rights, political rights, things like that. Well, guess what? Same correlation exists. It's this upward sloping line. As you increase economic freedom, those things increase. So it's not just about, we know this works. You can do all kinds of cross-country stories. You can go through and look at North Korea versus South Korea. Look at Ireland when they, in the 80s, what happened. You can look at East and West Germany. You can have all kinds of historical examples. We basically know this works. We don't really know how to implement it everywhere, but we know it works, right? But we have a tremendous challenge as economists, even though we know this works, because our challenge is one of making the unseen seen. We have to find a way to make the unseen visible to those around us. Nobody sees the beavers that don't exist. Nobody sees, right, the ladders that aren't there. Right? That's what economics illuminates for us. Right? It makes the unseen seen. So I'm going to tell you guys one more story with all of this kind of in mind to bring this in. And this one's actually my story. Right? This is a story of my family. So this is actually a story of when I was I lived in Northern Virginia for a while, not too far from here. I was in Centerville, Virginia. I came up to Leesburg every now and then. My brother-in-law was here, right? So I was in this neck of the woods. And it was when my wife and I were going to have our first child, right? So I'd like you guys to kind of meet the Clarks, essentially. So this is the Clarks. That's my daughter, Addison, on the left. She's strong and sassy. Love that girl, right? My oldest is the son at the bottom on the slide. He's incredibly caring and intelligent. And then the beautiful one up in the middle is, of course, me. No, that's my wife, right? And then the dorky one's me, right? So that's the Clarks, right? So this is the kind of our story of how we became a family. In 2010, we had Connor. So my wife was pregnant. We were new parents, right? It's our first child. It was nerve-wracking as all get up. We were walking all around. It was the middle of summer, so it was sweltering hot. And we're going through and we're waiting and we're waiting and we're waiting. And one night, my wife, we're really close to having this baby, we think, right? She's due any minute. My wife gets a headache. Okay, those things happen, right? Pretty bad. It sticks around for a little while. All right, we'll pay attention to it. She wakes up in the morning, she still has a headache. That's like one of those signs where it's like, call the doctor when you're really pregnant. I'm not telling you guys to do this, but, whatever, right? When you're really pregnant, if you sleep on it and you still have the headache, that might be an issue, so just call the doctor, right? So I call the doctor in the morning. She's like, yeah, we got to have you guys in based on everything else. Come into the hospital. Okay, so we go into the hospital. Things start progressing a little bit. And turns out my wife's in a little bit of trouble. It wasn't just, oh, she has a headache. She had preeclampsia, which is kind of like a blood pressure thing. Basically, you have to deliver the child, and then you're good to go. And other complications along with this. And all of a sudden, I'm going from, I'm going to have my first son, and I'm going to become a dad, and all this stuff, to, I might lose my wife. I didn't really know what to do. I was scared to death. I'm like sitting there, I'm like, okay, we're making some decisions. And the doctor tells me, hey, we can handle this. You know, you got a couple options. Here we go. You know, we have this lady who's a specialist at giving these C-sections. We can go through and do this. And they're like, we're making these decisions. Finally, we decide we have the C-section. We go in there. They're like, hey, you know, come on in. We'll tell you when we're ready. I feel like I sat down and they said, we're ready. And next thing I know, I have a son. They stitch her back up. They say, all vital signs are good. You guys are good to go. You're clear, right? And it was awesome. It was like this great thing. We were at a wonderful hospital, so I always show a picture of it. It was in Inova Hospital right in Fair Oaks, right? I absolutely loved my experience. I had 3 different specialists who helped us out. That to me, without them, I don't know if I have my wife, right? So you might say, okay, modern medicine is wonderful. Thanks, Dr. Clark, right? For basically scaring us into not having children, essentially, right? What does this have to do with your thesis so far? What does this have to do with economics? If you don't know by yet, whenever I talk about economics, I generally try not to talk about economics, essentially, right? Many social, moral, and political policies that we consider today aim to answer problems. They proffer suggestions to the questions as though we are capable of answering them through plan or through committee. Adam Smith, back in 1759, told us this. He said, the man of system is apt to be very wise in his own conceit. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. We think we can plan Tomorrowland. We think we can plan the mini CD. We think we can plan moral, social, and political policies to build towards a better future. But what markets actually do, what freedom actually does, is it takes that burden out of our hands. It places the cognitive burden. It places the cognitive burden of us figuring out what stuff we should do, what solutions are best, what things, what innovations will come into the future, and lets the market handle it. It takes the cognitive burden off of us because my cognitive burden can only handle so much, and it's not that great. And it places the cognitive burden of figuring out what Tomorrowland will look like or what should follow the CD, and it says market, or the being whose hand is invisible, as Adam Smith described the invisible hand process, and says, please, you take this burden. You take the cognitive burden of figuring all of this out. If we had to take the medical system from 1900 and locked into those practices and those regulations and those controls because we were saying, aha, we can figure it out, let's plan the medical system. Or even if we did this in 1950 and said, we know the innovations that we could have, and we polled experts and we brought them in, the medical system that we would have today would not have saved my wife. If I just by happenstance, and me and my wife would have been born in 1925, we would have gotten pregnant, we would have went into labor, and she would have died. And if we lock into those policies by saying we can plan our medical system, if we plan it, it doesn't progress the way that the market process does. It never gives us the MP3. It never gives us that step of innovation that we couldn't figure out except for millions and millions of people experimenting through the market process. I would have never had my son Connor. I would have never had my daughter Addison. And I would have never had, hopefully, the 3rd child on the way in a couple of weeks. Thankfully, I wasn't born in 1925, and we have this system. So we can think about what's happening here, right? We think about these bigger questions, And we can think about this soul of the market process, and do economists even have a soul? Good economists think about the economy as a process, as an emergent phenomenon, as this unfolding before us, and emphasize these ideas. When thinking about these bigger issues, these social policies, the moral questions, economics is not without a soul. It's even born from the words of a moral philosopher. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. We have to understand that economics gives us, it enlightens us. It gives us some insights about how a good society will actually exist, how it actually exists in practice. It helps us understand the phenomenon that happen by illuminating the unseen. It doesn't let us just go to our emotions and think about the dreams of a moral utopia. A good economist will always seem without a soul, because he will always consider beyond what is wished from a policy, and will look at what policies will actually do. A good economist will always seem without a soul, because he will consider the consequences of the unseen. He will respond to how do we do this next with the response, I don't know. Because the cognitive burden is carried best by the market process and not by an expert economist. His heart, the good economist, his heart lies not with the obvious desires for a better world, but with the non-obvious impact on the lives and livelihoods of millions. Thank you for your guys' time. We'll go to some questions. Make sure we get the microphone to you before we go. No questions. I nailed it out of the park. Economists have a soul. We're good to go. All right, we got one up here.
Thank you for coming out to speak today. So you said that economists, their job is not to predict the future. What about in a meta sense? You know, for instance, we have the Congressional Budget Office, which tells us we can expect to eliminate this amount from the deficit over the next 10 years. Is that a different scenario?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like forecasting and building a different future are two different things. So being fiscally responsible, like I forecast into my own budget, right, and make sure that I'm not overspending. So this year, you know, I could go through and like buy a Lexus and take 15 trips to Disney World, because that's what I would do if I was, whatever, right? And be really irresponsible. But it'd be prudent for me to think about into the future, right? But there's a line between what we're doing and big picture economics. Often we kind of lose, or sometimes we lose this insight, and non-economists especially lose this insight, that we're not on this straightforward trajectory. So it's different between financial awareness of like what our budget's going to be, thinking about the macroeconomy in terms of you know, what's going to end up having to happen through the Fed, what they're going to have to do, and what the federal budget, what's going to happen to the federal budget. Those kind of things. I'm not saying you shouldn't be aware of the future, and I'm not even saying no one plans the future. I'm actually saying everyone plans the future, right? It's just there's no one game plan that we're on. It's going to take the experiment of all of us to give our own little inputs to build towards that future through spontaneous order, right? So it's not the same question of you know, looking at future expenses or running a state budget or running a federal budget. The difference in that comes from if the federal budget starts to be used for, okay, we're going to build this society essentially. We have to be responsible for handling public goods or other things, right? We have to say, okay, we only have so much money for the roads. So let's make sure that we don't spend it all or try and build towards more money from the roads or whatever. But if we take the wrong paradigm of thinking that it's on us to build the future through the federal government or through state governments as a primary source of growth, we end up with stories of unintended consequences. We end up with lack of growth, essentially. We plan for something that we will never achieve. So I'm not saying the future is impossible in all elements or we shouldn't look towards it. But there's this kind of bigger sense of us thinking about constructing the future versus allowing it to unfold. That is, at its root, the main thing that we know from economics. And that's where that can be a part of, not all of, but a part of our inputs for making these moral decisions, right? But it'll seem like a soulless money grab because it doesn't feel good. It's not saying, hey, let's do this. It works really well. It's saying, oh, we have to look at the unintended consequences of this and think about the unseen and think about how this process will unfold without saying, oh, I can build better education or I can build a better welfare system or what's happening with that. So it's really an overarching mindset, a paradigm of economics that good economists, mainline economists, emergent order economists, free market economists try to push, and the average person doesn't appreciate. And so they don't see the economy working the way good economists do. Any other questions? I was warned about this guy. He's told he has really hard questions, so. My answer is I don't know. All right off the bat.
All right, so I have two questions. First, you kept emphasizing that good economists view markets as a process. What are the opposing views of that? How do some economists in the past, how have they viewed markets as something other than a process, and why is viewing it as a process better than those alternatives? And second, it's very fascinating answering the question, do economists have souls? And your conclusion seems to be they seem to not have souls, but they do. How can economists seem to have souls better in their rhetoric and how they talk about these issues and their viewpoint on how the market works? So.
Wow, two good questions. I mean, yikes, I was warned correctly. Yeah. Let's move on. Now, I'll answer the second one first because that's fresh in my head to think about. So the basic idea of, well, if the economist's soul seems unseen, right? How do we do that? What do we do with rhetoric, etc.? My approach is to try and spread the message by talking about non-monetary things, seemingly economic models or whatever, and talking about everyday life. It's a project that a lot of groups, a lot of think tanks, a lot of different places are working on. It's not an easy thing. And what I think happens with a lot of students is they go through like an econ program and they think like they're going to figure it out and it's going to be like an answer, and then it's like eventually we'll get economics right. The problem with it is we had economics right in 1776 with Adam Smith. Modern economists constantly publish in journals and they're like, hey, we have this cool, neat little behavioral twist on how humans behave. And it turns out Adam Smith said it. And hey, we have this really neat kind of cool thing that we can talk about in development economics. And that's basically what Adam Smith said, right? So in answering your question or talking about your question, I think that's the challenge of economics. James Buchanan said the message of Adam Smith needed reiteration at each generation. It's not just this, oh, we did it, we've won, we figured it out, we cured, whatever the disease is, essentially. That'll never happen. It'll continue to be this question forever. It's a fight that we have to make by being more persuasive, by being more open to talking about it. Academic economists, a lot of times now at the higher levels, love just building really fancy models and doing some neat little tweak within the journals that nobody reads except their four buds who also know how to do this really crazy weird thing with the math, and then they showed something that nobody cares about. That happens some. Now, they're trying to get at some truths, and sometimes those things matter. I think there's a place for that. I don't think that's pointless. But that's not going to win the battle that I'm talking about. The battle of economics is a battle of ideas, and it will wage on for forever. As long as we have commercial society, this isn't going away. How do you do it best? I don't know. I try. I try really hard. Try and communicate better. There's different avenues that people have gone through. The market-oriented crowd has a really big presence online. There's a lot of great think tanks right here in the DC area that go through it. Shoot, the sponsoring organization of this whole get-together does an incredible amount of stuff, like bringing people out to just say, think about this. I don't need you to be persuaded by me. At least have thought this through once, right? And those foundations are doing great stuff. Your guys' professors here, I know, try and challenge you guys to get you thinking about these ideas so that you can become better informed citizens and not be kind of swayed by policies that say, we're going to make ladders safer. Oh, turns out we made it more dangerous, right? And actually thinking through those policies. If I had an answer for that, I would be doing a better job than I am right now, right? Right? It's a challenge. It's always going to be a challenge, essentially. What was the first question? I don't remember anymore. Sorry. Do you remember? Forget it. Yes. All right. His questions were too tough. What was it?
The question was about alternative models to the market process.
Okay, so alternative models to the market process. That's kind of what I got into a little bit with some economists, just building models that are essentially equations that aren't looking at the unfolding process. So looking at a static picture, essentially, of a one-shot, something's going to happen. And thinking, if we put this tax in place, here we have a solution. So an example of this that I teach an international trade class. We put a tariff or a tax on, or an export tax on luxury goods going out. Yeah, a tax on luxury goods going out so that we will basically produce fewer of those things, so then it'll become relatively cheaper for people to consume cheap things here. Right? Well, what ends up happening is those things, and we try and subsidize those things. What ends up happening is those things become cheaper, but they also become cheaper to produce, right? And so the theory is, hey, we're going to come through and have more of this cheap stuff around. But in the long run, as the market unfolds, some of these profit incentives will change the actual market structure, and we might not have those things around, right? The best example of this actually is there's a really recent paper by this guy at Stanford. So how many of you guys have had an econ class before? How many of you guys in your econ classes did some example of the minimum wage? Like that's like bread and butter of economics, right? To show unintended consequences. So this guy at Stanford did this kind of more process-oriented thought about the minimum wage. So the best story against the standard economists' take on the minimum wage. The standard economists' take on the minimum wage is, hey, you put a price floor in place, it's going to create unemployment, and poor people are actually going to be unemployed from this because you just raised their rates, right? So we just made it more expensive to hire low-skilled workers, essentially. So what do people, like say I'm a business owner, and all of you guys are low-skilled labor, and I'd like to hire all of you for $7 an hour, but then we put a minimum wage at $10 an hour, and I say, ooh, you guys over there, sorry, right? I'm not going to hire you anymore, right? So it hurts some of the poor of our society. Okay, well, the good story of the minimum wage, the best economists who don't believe in that story, the story that they tell is basically a story of an inelastic demand curve, which essentially says, yeah, you have to pay more, say $10, and maybe you don't hire more people, everybody, but you only don't hire one guy. So all of you guys get way higher wages, and only one or two people don't get hired. Right? So the price of that of all of these poor people in terms of their labor, they get way higher wages, and only a very few don't get hired on. And that would happen if you had an inelastic demand curve. Okay, so if you think about that in a static sense, and you just build this model and you say, oh, here's what happened to unemployment, this can happen fine. This guy at Stanford kind of did a Milton Friedman thing, and he said, I'm going to take your model, and see what happens if we think about it through a process, right? What actually happens? How does this market actually unfold? And what did he do? He said, okay, so here's what happens. Let's say that it's a really inelastic demand curve, which doesn't really make sense to me, but let's just go with it, right? Let's go with it that low-skilled labor, we really have an inelastic demand curve for that, right? Okay, so your price goes way up in terms of me hiring you out, and very, very few of you, maybe only one of you, don't get hired. What kind of places hire people at minimum wage? Places like McDonald's, Walmart, whatever, places like that, close to those wages, whatever, right? Or feel the pressure from minimum wage. Places that produce things that are really cheap. Okay. Who shops at places where things are really cheap? Yeah. At least this one does. The poor people do. Poor people in general. That one guy and all the rest of you too. You're much more likely to go to McDonald's if you're a poor person than me, fancy rich guy. Well, wait a minute. The minimum wage makes your wages go way up. So what happens to the prices at McDonald's? They have to go up. So who does that actually end up hurting? It turns out that those wage hikes turn into higher prices, and it actually hurts the poor people more than it helps them. It's going beyond stage one, right? It's thinking about this kind of unfolding. It's not thinking of, hey, in the history of economic ideas, we have lots around the turn of the 19th century. We start to develop in the progressive era all these stories of market failure, right? So you can think of Pigouvian taxes if you've done public finance with your professors here, or maybe even in micro. All these market failure stories come up, asymmetric information. If we look at that in a static sense, like, hey, we have a problem, you can say, we should do this regulation or tax this situation or put a tariff in place or something like that, and we could help things out. But if you look at it as a process, you say, hey, I'm Ronald Coase. I think this might get resolved better through alternative means. I think we might overcome some externality problems or some market failure problems or the problems of asymmetric information, like I said with the Fujicate thing, if we let people find solutions to this, right? A story, if anybody can find this story for me, I've heard it orally a couple of times, but I've never been able to track it down despite the wonders of the internet, right? But Disney, because I love Disney, right? Disney, when they came out with the VHSs, right, they were like the big dogs within the movie industry, right? And they were super worried because you guys don't have kids yet, so maybe you don't know this. Maybe you have little brothers or sisters or something. But you know all the Disney movies, right? What do kids do with Disney movies? They watch them over and over and over again, right? Over and over and over and over again. I can't get the Bubble Guppies theme song out of my head because I have little kids, right? You don't know Bubble Guppies yet, but you might, right? Disney says, oh my gosh, we make kids movies. If we sell VHSs, instead of the kids coming to the theater, and the theater, and the theater, and the theater, and us making all kinds of money, they're going to get a VHS and watch it over and over and over again and only have to pay once. So what they tried to do, this is the part where I can't verify this, but I've heard it a couple of different ways, is they tried to make a one-use VHS that would like clip the tape when you were done. So that if you wanted to watch Snow White again, you had to buy it again, right? It's like, holy cow. Well, it didn't turn out they didn't actually end up doing this, producing whatever, and they found that actually allowing the kids to watch Snow White, or what have you, even though Snow White's really scary if you actually watch it, right? Right? If you allow them to watch Finding Nemo or something like that over and over and over again, they want to go to Disney World. They want to watch the cartoons. Now they want to download the apps. They want the stuffed animals. They want the toys. And it actually works out for them, right? Now, I'm not saying in all situations just like let it be in, who cares about your product, and let it go out, right? But those thoughts of a failure of the market, oh, we have to solve it now, and we could build a model that solves it now, happens some in economics, and I think it happens even more without an official model in the real world, right? So that's a continual trend of the history of economic thought and just of civilization and just dealing with the everyman. We got one over here. If you guys want to go to her. She looks nicer.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. One question that I have that we deal a lot with when facing public policy decisions, for those of us who want to go into lawmaking and that type of thing, is when there is market failure, do we just wait indefinitely for it to fix itself? Because one of the roles of government is to protect the helpless and to defend justice. And because the market responds to demand, what happens when that demand is not there? For example, obviously when we had segregation in the South with businesses discriminating against blacks, policy at that point stepped in because the market was not responding, because we can say, oh, we can boycott it and then those businesses will change. But the demand obviously has to be there. So if the majority isn't doing that, then businesses don't respond. Or maybe they would have eventually, but do we just wait? Do we allow injustice to occur until that occurs? Currently then we also have the issue of infant mortality rates, which you had kind of perhaps touched on, but the U.S. is actually 27th, and there are so many countries that are before us and do so much better with that. And the issue in the States is not that that is across the board, but rather that our infant mortality rates are so much higher in low-income areas and for poor people. So obviously, again, that's another issue of demand where, of course, in the States, the market is responding to our need for prenatal care and all of that, but it's not the same for wealthy versus poor. So again, it's just sometimes we have those market failures. Perhaps they'll correct eventually, but can we afford, as from the side of public policy, to simply allow injustices to occur indefinitely, waiting for a solution when the demand may not be there because it's a minority of people, not a majority?
Yeah. I think some of these questions, I mean, there's a lot of different answers here. Each policy is going to have a lot of different things going on. Some of them, I think that you even touched on. I'm not an expert in any of the areas that you really went into. But we also have to ask ourselves the question of, did our legislation create this? You can say, oh, it's a market failure, but a lot of times what's happening in these situations is actually a failure of policy in the first place. So I'm not saying markets always work and just freedom and, hey, let's get rid of the government, anarcho-capitalism for the win, yay, or something like that, right? But a lot of times we like to think about crony capitalism as being capitalism. And then we say, it failed, right? And it's like, well, yeah, there's all of these other influences that are taking place here. And we can say that like with, if you're an environmentalist here, if you're saying, well, shoot, we should be using geothermal and solar, and we should, people don't insulate their houses very well, and that's just incredibly inefficient and all of this stuff, right? And we're not using this stuff. Well, a lot of the environmental energy sector is incredibly crony. Right? It's like we have all these different subsidies that are taking place and influencing the market and then saying the market's screwing up. Well, okay, right? Another issue that I would point to, like especially with like the segregation issue, and say the demand's not there. If the demand really, really, really isn't there, the policy won't make it work, almost always, and it'll probably end up being worse. But it can serve as like a focal point, right? So if you've not heard of focal points, it's like it makes it central so that everybody can kind of rally around it. But what that's basically doing is codifying what the market preferences actually are within legislation. That would be good legislation. Hayek has this great dichotomy between law and legislation. And what legislation is for is just to codify the law. What is the law? It's the norms that we all practice right, that actually rule what we're going through, what we engage in. So, like, we all walk on the right of each other, right? Well, then the legislation should come through and say we drive on the right, right? If we all start to kind of rally around getting rid of segregation, the legislation should come through and it'll stick that way. It'll actually work, potentially, if it doesn't run into the wrong hands and all of that stuff, right? If it works. I'm not going to argue no role for government or something like that. I'm not going to argue that the poor and the wealthy don't have it differently. I'm not going to argue that we should never have anything, government intervention. But in 95% of what we do, we take for granted the market process and we think we have a solution and we don't see how we've screwed things up in the past, right? And so my basic message really is one of just have some humility. Don't think you can plan Tomorrowland, right? If you go at trying to change policy, when you actually get into that world, you see a lot of pork. You see a lot of excess spending on things that have nothing to do with actually making that policy help out the poorest among us, right? And if we can think about, I don't want to get into this too much because we're going to talk about this tomorrow a little bit when we talk about inequality issues. But Adam Smith in 1759, not in The Wealth of Nations, which is 1776, which is why we all know that year, right? Because it's the year that Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, right? 17 years before that, 1759, he writes The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And we all know the phrase, the invisible hand. If you don't, I talked about it tonight. It's like central to economics. It's in the first part of the econ textbook, always. He mentions the invisible hand once in The Theory of Moral Sentiments and once in The Wealth of Nations. And both of them are right smack dab in the middle of the book. And both of them are central to the entire overall case that he makes, this case of spontaneous order. When he's in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, the idea that he is talking about when he makes his central claim of the invisible hand is inequality. And he says, what do markets do? They don't necessarily solve right away for the poorest among us, but what they do is they take what's a luxury for kings today and make it common for the everyman tomorrow. And who cares if Bill Gates has 3 jets? Or who cares if you have a Rolex? I have a cheap watch that can still tell the time. What we really care about is not money and these luxury items. What we care about is what can lead us towards fulfillment, what can allow us to experience life, what can allow us to engage with our family members, our loved ones, and try and see what we are. And those things, the market passes down from the wealthy to the poor. Will it always do that? Will it always work out? Maybe not. But we have to be humble in thinking, maybe it does. It's a message of humility, not of direction. I'm not saying there should never be a law that helps out. But I mean, if I look at infant mortality rates, like you said, we're 27th. That doesn't necessarily mean we're bad for 27th in the world. Like, that's a little arrogant if we think we should be number 1 at everything, first of all, right? But maybe it is bad. But how did that come about, right? What policies led to that? There's a great website, FDAreview.org. A couple of guys at George Mason, Alex Tabarrok and Dan Klein, put it together. And it looks at what happened when the FDA was implemented. And it shows a lot of these projections of, like, new drugs that are going to come out to help the everyman, the poor man, all of this stuff, right? And we were on a certain trajectory. The FDA comes through and starts regulating things, and our trajectory for creation of drugs, what did it do? It cut off completely. Because we wanted to make sure that we were going to help the everyman, because medicine is something we should all have. So we stepped in and we said, let's make this focal. Let's make sure that everybody has access to this stuff. Well, it turned out that now we have a medical system that's probably 15 years behind what it could have been. Now, is there going to be any cases where the FDA saved somebody's life? For sure, right? But who died because of the FDA? A bunch of unseen people who didn't get their medication because it was still being processed or it created too much cost for people to consider, right? I'm not saying do away with it. There's no cases. We have to look at those cases, but look at it with humility. Look at it as though we can't necessarily design this to be better, and maybe it's us that's screwing it up with our policy. It's not a 100% liberty axiom, it always works. It's a maxim. And that's what Adam Smith created, a presumption of liberty. Just like we take a presumption of innocence, that's all I'm asking you to take as like a policymaker. Say, presume the market works and we screwed it up unless we can prove otherwise. If you can meet that evidentiary burden, awesome. Go for it, right? But until you meet that burden, don't assume you're in the right, right? Until you can meet that burden. Great question. I think that's a challenge for us to take on, too.
Is this thing working?
Yep.
I would just like to add that our friend Russ Roberts, I heard a podcast in the fall last year, and he was interviewing somebody who had done a study on infant mortality rates and looking at the difference between the United States and other countries. And actually, most of the difference between us and the European countries is actually attributable to the way that they count an infant mortality versus the way that we do. Like 75% of the difference is attributable to that. So what it seems like these great big differences in data that you'll see reported in newspapers is actually much, much smaller. And that's not comforting. I know, it's still like, it's not comforting, but it makes us that we have to look at, we're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges.
Thank you so much for coming this evening. We've very much enjoyed your talk. I appreciate the way you've humanized the study of economics and your discussion of epistemic humility in the context of economics. And in fact, your discussion sounds almost like an Aristotelian model of economics in pursuit of the good, which is ironic given some of the delightful tensions between our political theory major and economics major here at Patrick Henry. But I'm curious, in an Aristotelian model of pursuit of the good, there is a telos, an end that is hoped to be achieved. In the context of a market, does the market progress towards something? Is there a good end towards which it is moving? Or does it simply proceed? And if it simply proceeds, to what do we attribute our trust, confidence, hope in the good outcomes of the market?
Whew. All right, great question. This is a question I get at Hillsdale a lot because we have that same tension, all right, between our departments and all of this stuff. I tend to think that it tends towards something that is the good or close towards it, but it's not guaranteed. We could proceed. Adam Smith gives all kinds of examples of the invisible hand proceeding towards bad things. But it gives us a framework for thinking about, okay, if we have certain ends that we would like to achieve, if we think of society as having some goals, do we proceed in those directions? So if we kind of take a Austrian approach, I could say, listen, I don't have any goals in mind. I'm letting the goals be yours. Whatever your idea of the good is, right? And most people, the idea of the good that they put forward is rather simple, right? There's like some things we'd like to do away with. We'd like peace and prosperity, essentially. We would like avenues for fulfillment. The ideas that I talked about with the prosperity index, right? If I let that be the goal, do we head towards your stated goal? And it seems like markets tend to head towards your stated goal a lot better than places that don't have markets, right? Does it necessarily, like, the being whose hand is invisible, is that God? I don't know, right? Is that something that's going to be the moral society? Are we going to learn? I tend to think that it does lead towards a better society, but I'm not saying that it's concrete, definitive. But as economists and being humble, what we do is we just provide an input for thinking about the good. So we wrap in the politics majors and the philosophy people and say, let's think about the good. Our input is, what rules help us achieve that? right? What rules help us move in that direction? And it tends to be that the solutions to that are more spontaneous order than planned and directed, is what I tend to see as coming out. But it's a judgment call. There's some things, to me, this is the Smithian side of me. There's some things in life that are like rules of grammar. They're black and white. You can violate them or not, right? You can say, John goes to work, and that does not violate the rules of grammar. It's black and white. You didn't violate the rules of grammar. But there's other things like aesthetics, that in determining them, they're loose, vague, and indeterminate. John went to work is not really beautiful, right? But that's our judgments that come together for it. I think what the good society is takes our judgments, and it takes something that I can't prove, and we have to make these judgment calls. I can't sit down and QED you a market economy. I have to bring in moral judgments and say, I think this is the best, and where are we heading? Right? So, I mean, I don't really have an answer for you other than economists basically, we kind of dodge this question to some extent. We're just an input. We're not a solution to that. It's not a philosophy that we've said, we've proven this, at least for most of us, hopefully.
It turns out that others and culture setters are important after all.
Maybe.
Thanks for speaking to us. You said that most of the time the free market makes the right decision, but not always. Which exceptions, if any, justify government intervention, and how much?
I don't have a bullet point list for you or anything like that. I tend to think that, first of all, what's really important that we know markets seem to work, and there's like 95% of the issues, it's clear cut, like minimum wage. Like, let's get rid of this. Crony capitalism, we know, hey, let's not try and regulate this market, fine. But what areas could there be restrictions for this? I actually would point you to a paper by my dissertation advisor, Dan Klein, called Mere Libertarianism, that looks at kind of some flaws of perfect markets always working. And it says, listen, we don't just have, hey, QED, the markets worked. Maybe there's some exceptions. Maybe there's some inconsistencies. Maybe there's some things in there. And he points to, and I would kind of fall back on his thoughts here, things like curfew laws. Like, so during a riot, the government could step in and say, everybody has to go in or else we can arrest you, right? So if there's a riot going on, hey, maybe the government comes in and says, here we go. Hayek talks about a social safety net at the end of the Constitution of Liberty, right? Maybe we have some basic level of social safety net that you could be on for a while and then moves forward. I don't really have a plan for our legislative involvement. That's not really my specialty. I think it's okay to have some marginal government interventions, but almost every time I look into anything that I think is a reasonable idea, I end up going, holy cow. Actually applying this is not just what we wanted it to be. If you go to DC and you make policy, you say, this is what's going to be in the policy. Read through one of them. It's not just one thing. Everybody tacks onto it and gets their little loopholes and all this stuff. So we can deal with this false reality of, oh, we want these interventions because it will do this. But that's not reality. It's just like I could talk to you guys about markets and say, I want markets because it'll do everything for you. And you'd say, well, that's not realistic. He doesn't know market failures and these kind of things. Well, okay, you wanting intervention have to ask those same questions then, right? In reality, how can I get these things through? So I think there's some areas, but I don't have like a long list of all of these things that could go through. That paper, Mere Libertarianism, though, that's like when I went through grad school, that was a paper that was like one of those kind of like light bulb moments for you when you read a book or a paper or something, you're like, that one was one of those for me. And it does go through and kind of list some exceptions maybe that we would want to market economies. So I don't really have an answer for you other than the couple of minor examples that I gave you. And maybe something like we talk about, like maybe interventions. We even talk about, have a paper on liberty where maybe like banning owning like bazookas, right? Not like, hey, handguns or something, but like the average person just can't own a tank or something like that, right? Because, and you can look at that through the lens of liberty in different ways by saying, okay, yes, you're coercing him and stepping on his liberty in like this direct sense, but you're preventing him from infringing upon thousands of people's liberty in this overall sense by not allowing them. So I think there's nuances to it. I think it's an approach to economics that Adam Smith did. I think it's an approach that we all should do as good economists, but the main point of it is that we're like so way over here in our everyday thinking that the details of like the 98 to 100%, I just don't really care about, right? Like, let's get rid of these war on poverty that's keeping the inner city who are impoverished poor, keeping them off the economic ladder. Let's stop doing this. It's a terrible thing. We don't need the details of, well, where do we stop with freedom, right? Where do we stop with freedom? We're at like 40% now, and we should move to 95% or something like that, or 80% even, right? And those are my concerns. It gets to the question that he asked, well, you know, how do we persuade? Well, the main things that we need to persuade about, the obvious things, not the intricacies, those are what I care about more so. So I don't get into a lot of like, I don't pay attention to everyday policies and, oh, this one or that one. I'm more, if you heard my introduction, more long-run political economy oriented. So I'm essentially dodging your question too. Sorry, I'm really good at that. You should be a politician.
I don't think that your tank ban rule would pass Buchanan's unanimity rule, because when you said that, Russell over there was cringing. He's like, I want to own a tank.
I'll move it back to the constitutional level then, Russell, and maybe Buchanan will let it go. Oh, sorry, I couldn't see you.
Thank you very much for coming out. It's been very interesting so far. I had a question about for what reason we should have or not have certain policies about economics. For example, the minimum wage, the 40-hour work week cap. These things seem to be made because we want people to be happier, and so we don't want them to be paid too little or to work too much, so forth. Same thing with food quality control, safety regulations. And what economists will say is, well, if you have a minimum wage, then fewer people can work, and our argument seems to be that we have economic inefficiencies when we have these regulations. And so the argument seems to be about inefficiency versus happiness. So for what reason should we have policies in place? Should we measure things in terms of happiness gained or lost, or by economic inefficiency? And also, I was wondering if you thought I might be setting up a false dichotomy here. If we had more economic efficiency, would it lead to greater overall happiness?
Yeah, this kind of gets to what I said about economics as an input, right? I'm not here to say, hey, our system should be X, Y, Z, but economics can be an input to us talking about, hey, do we care about efficiency and progress? Like, if we move the fastest into the future and we became the Jetsons, is that what we want, right? Or is it happiness? And you guys, philosophy or politics people maybe even here, like, should happiness be the goal, right? Or, should we strive for something else, the good, that's not necessarily just being happy? I think those are philosophical questions that economics is just an input to. When you think about stuff like the minimum wage and you say, oh, well, it's just all about inefficiency or whatever, or capping what people can make, and it seems to be all about money and this kind of stuff. The question that economics makes us ask is, well, where do those values come from if not from the market, right? Like we think, oh, that person makes too little. This argument comes up in international trade all the time. I hear this, my family members and stuff all kind of like get into, well, China makes really cheap stuff, right? China. It's like the arch enemy all of a sudden now, right? They make all this cheap stuff, and we shouldn't be having stuff that's like this cheap. I like cheap stuff. I'm cheap. I drive a Honda Fit because it was the cheapest car that I could find, right? So the market's saying, hey, maybe some people want these things that are cheaper here. I like to work 80 hours a week right now. So when I have grandkids, I can spend all my time with them. Who's to make that judgment that I should be happy if I only work 40 hours a week? How do we make that decision? Who can make that decision the best? The people with the local knowledge of their situation. Some weeks I work 80 hours. I do. And some weeks I work 8 hours. That's my decision, right, to go into that. And who's to say, okay, what's happening is this. With the minimum wage, what we know, and this is why I think the basics of economics is so important, we end up with so many negative consequences that it will be inefficient and unhappy, right? So we tell this story, Jackson's this not so nice city near Hillsdale, and it's where like a local prison is. And we say the minimum wage law is essentially why there's so many people in Jackson State Prison. And the reason for that is, what happened? Who are low-skilled workers? These inner-city workers who could work for like $6 an hour. They no longer can be hired. So what do? They go to their next best alternative. What's their next best alternative? It's selling drugs. What does selling drugs do? It gets them in jail. Happiness. Minimum wage, yay, right? Like, there's no story there that's like, well, you just care about money and we're caring about happiness. We don't even have to get into that with most of the stories, right? Ben Powell, I don't know if you guys have heard this story too about like sweatshops. So the same kind of thing, like should we allow them to make such little wages, right? So Ben Powell did this study where he went through and he looked at all these different sweatshops and he looked at all of our like complaints about sweatshops. So he went through the newspapers and said, okay, let's have you, like Kathy Lee Gifford and all these people, pick out the worst cases of sweatshops and advertise them and say, these are awful, right? These are the bad places throughout the world. Don't buy from Nike or whoever that uses these. And he tells this story of, okay, if we look at all these different places, what ends up happening in those situations? Well, it turns out that those places actually pay more than like the median income in their countries. Okay? Second of all, he tells this story of a senator who decided to, in the United States, put up this bill that was going to ban some imports basically from like this one country because they were using sweatshop labor, et cetera. So before the policy even got enacted, that country cut off their manufacturing because they were afraid that they were going to lose all their stuff from the United States. And what happened was incredibly devastating and sad because their next best alternative from working in that plant, it wasn't just going and selling drugs, it was child prostitution. And you had like 60% or something of those workers turn to that industry. Because we didn't want to charge them so little. There's no story there where happiness and inefficiency, it's all about the money, right? It's about the human condition and the chance for thriving, and we're an input to being able to talk about policies that can promote that, right? We want to think about those things. I don't think it's necessarily a trade-off, the good, happiness, and money or something like that. We want to look, what I want you guys to do is look at the simple cases where those three things are totally in line. I want you to think about, have a vision of the ultimate system that you would have, and consider those trade-offs. But that doesn't mean with the practical policies we get lost with this utopia that you've created, and we miss the point that we're sending innocent kids into these bad situations where they're selling drugs or childhood prostitution or something like that, where it's clear that's not the way to go. It's not for happiness. It's not for efficiency. It's not for money's sake. It's nothing along those lines, right? We have to think about those consequences as well.
We're going to turn the microphone over to our sponsor for just a second, and then we'll let
All right.
Octobant send us on our way here.
Hi guys, my name is Beth Erber and I work for the Institute for Humane Studies. We sponsored this talk tonight and we sponsor a lot of talks like it and educational events. If you're interested in free markets and individual liberty, you should definitely look us up. Also, if you're interested in grad school, we help students who are interested in those ideas with resources and scholarships and things like that. And because we believe in incentives, I have a little short survey for you guys to fill out on tonight's talk so that we can get feedback on Dr. Clark and get your interest in our programs. And I'm offering a drawing for 2 $25 Amazon gift cards if you fill them out with everybody in the room. So come see me after this and grab a survey, take 10 seconds, fill it out, and thank you for your time.
So thanks again to everybody for coming out. Before we give Dr. Clark a round of applause, remember there's still some snacks over there. So before you go to the midnight madness basketball thing, go get hopped up on sugar and coffee. Okay? So let's join me in giving Dr. Clark a round of applause.
Thank you guys for being here.